Thank you, Aurimas, for your welcoming address. And now I have to say that we have two special guests. We are very glad that the representatives of the United Kingdom of Great Britain are with us. And I would like to say that we are very delighted that Monica White has agreed to act as a moderator, but even more, I am delighted that she also agreed to act as a summarizer of the conference. So all our papers will be scrutinized, will be under her watchful eyes, and I call her to come and take her seat by this table. And I will be giving over my chairing over to her, and another speaker who will be opening this conference as a scientific event is no other than Jonathan Shepard. I will not be exaggerating, but this scholar is well known around the world, and in many academic circles you can feel that he is known, his works are cited, and his accomplishments are celebrated far and wide. So, dear Jonathan, please come to the pulpit and give us an introductory lecture to our conference.
Well, thank you very much, Darius, and after that introduction, it's a tough act to follow. Firstly, with a brief definition of the term soft power in the title of my paper. Soft power is a means of predisposing in favor of a particular culture and polity those who do not formally belong. They may not want to belong fully, but their goodwill and desire to associate with that culture can further the interests of the presiders over the culture exerting powers of attraction. The politico-military dividends can be all the greater when agency is not in the hands of a single player. The term soft power was coined to characterize the multifaceted mechanisms of 20th century American hegemony. But I think it holds true of the ways in which the East Roman Empire, or Byzantium, as I'll rather old-fashionedly call it, could still attract long after its material resources began to wane. Soft power's operators tend to be all the more attractive through not being obvious organs of government, sometimes being ready to go against the line of the government of a day. One should conceive of Byzantium as functioning as a polyphony, not unlike modern America. The reign of Michael VIII Palaeologus serves to illustrate these cross-currents. Badly in need of naval resources to secure himself against neighbouring powers, Michael looked to the Latin West, first and foremost the Genoese. Michael's readiness to demean himself is shown by the silk, depicting the special ties between his realm and the patron saint of Genoa, St. Lawrence. Michael enters Genoa's cathedral guided by the saint, while the silk's inscription calls him merely Emperor of the Greeks, Imperator Graecorum, in flagrant breach of imperial conventions. The silk is an instance of soft power at work and shows how far the imperial establishment was willing to go in hopes of harnessing hard power to its cause. I'll set aside the Council of Lyons, culminating in the Union of 1274, which earned Michael execration and eventual excommunication from churchmen and monks, and was immediately revoked after his death by his son Andronicus. I'll simply warn against dismissing the very idea of a concordat with the papacy as doomed to failure at the hands of hardliners. Recent research has shown how divides between Eastern and Western Christian doctrine and modes of worship were often more elastic and bridgeable than one might suppose from the polemical tracts in circulation or from the stances periodically struck especially around the time of the Council of Florence. But Eastern churchmen's capacity to obstruct the quest for military manpower from the Latin West is not my prime concern. Instead, I want to fill in the general backdrop to the Byzantino-Lithuanian relations. I shall point to a number of long-term constants in East Roman diplomacy that may help make sense of the few bits of evidence about exchanges between East Roman and Lithuanian churchmen and rulers at our disposal. First, though, one should bear in mind another geopolitical constant in East Roman diplomacy: imperial statesmen's long-standing concern with the southern stretches of the region that came under Lithuanian dominion. The surest indication of imperial interest comes from the 1190s. At that time, the prince in control of the Gallic-Volyn region and lands, Roman Mstislavich, was thought worthy of a girl from imperial circles, if not the ruling family itself, to be his second wife. I'll set aside the question whether she was a daughter of Isaac II Angelus, called Euphrosyne or some other name, or a member of the Kamateros family, probably named Maria. What's hardly in doubt is that the emperor honored Roman thus with an eye to military liaison. That Prince Roman lived up to Emperor Isaac's expectations is suggested by the historian Nikitas Koniates' fulsome portrayal. Koniates singled him out among the Rus princes, crediting him with putting a stop to the incursions of the Cumans and Vlachs, which, he said, might otherwise have reached Constantinople's land walls. Quote, "Strong of body and dexterous of hand, Roman stayed the attacks of the Cumans and brought respite for the long-suffering Romans," Byzantines. Koniates, although well-informed, doesn't mention Roman's imperial marriage alliance or attribute his intervention to imperial diplomacy. The Rus' aid, campaigning out into the steppes, was, quote, "unexpected," and, Koniates further asserts, they were acting of their own accord, while also, quote, "yielding to the entreaties of their chief Shepard." In other words, the Metropolitan of Kiev of the day, the Byzantine-born Metropolitan Nicephorus. Koniates' implicit yet emphatic denial of any role in this for imperial diplomacy is noteworthy, and not just for being implausible. He can hardly have been unaware of top-level diplomatic initiatives around 1200, given that he was then effectively head of the civil service. Whatever the exact reason for imperial statesmen obfuscating their role in prompting Roman's intervention, their cover story is suggestive. It was upon the entreaties of the Metropolitan that the most Christian people of the Rus, quote unquote, had come to the Romans' rescue. In other words, the readiness of a Metropolitan in a foreign land to throw his weight behind assisting Constantinople in time of need was a working assumption in imperial circles. This would have held true in the 14th century as in the 13th, and so, presumably, would their sense of the striking power of princes in control of the Gallic-Volyn lands. Something of this sense comes out in a letter of Patriarch Germanus II addressing Roman cardinals about church union, not long before the debates on doctrine and papal primacy held in 1234 in Nicaea, where Germanus was lodged. Germanus lists all the Christian peoples looking to him for guidance, among them, quote, "the victorious kingdom of the Bulgarians and the innumerable population of Rus." Alexander Mayorov fairly characterizes Daniel as, quote, "the most devoted to the Greeks amongst Rus princes," and sees the reference to the Rus' vast numbers as conveying the threat that the cardinals, along with the Latin rulers in Constantinople in 1234, would have to reckon with formidable opponents if they failed to reach agreement in the forthcoming negotiations over church union. Admittedly, Prince Daniel's hold over Galich was slicer than his father Roman's. He lost control to the princes of Chernihiv in 1235, soon had to look to King Biela IV of Hungary for support, and found it politic to come to terms with the papacy, to the point of being crowned by Pope Innocent IV's legate in 1254. Nonetheless, his cultural-religious orientation remained Eastern Christian, and this is probably an inheritance, literally, from his Byzantine-born mother. She may well have had a hand in the princely scriptorium in Galich, providing source materials for a no longer extant chronicle. That Daniel likewise associated historical writing with rulership emerges from the svod, or compilation, he commissioned with leitmotifs evoking monarchical, almost imperial, rule. Something of his taste for Greek-style political culture is discernible in the monumental building works and church furnishings he commissioned at Holm, which he sought to establish as sacral centre and his principal seat. Daniel seems not merely to have had a taste for deluxe goods from the East Roman world, but also to have appreciated the authority symbols. This emerges from an episode in the Galich-Volhynian Chronicle. Daniel is said to have donned, quote, Greek silk dyed pure purple, olivier, and gold brocade for a meeting attended by Western imperial envoys, only for the Hungarian king, Biela, to reproach him. Our chronicle's designation of Daniel's garment as olivier, deriving from holaveros, a term uncommon even in Byzantine Greek texts, suggests knowledge from the spoken word, and familiarity with imperial court culture. The question of how brocade and Greek silk dyed pure purple, thus presumably of imperial Byzantine manufacture, came into Daniel's hands is thorny. He could have inherited them from his mother, but some allowance should be made for their possible arrival via one of the embassies shuttling between the courts of Daniel and the Nicene emperors. This may seem implausible, but as I'll try and show in practice, the restrictions on giving out authority symbols were not enforced as strictly as our Byzantine written texts make out. Even lesser potentates could receive gifts with visual imagery conveying notions of sovereignty, and any master of the Galich-Volyn region in the 13th century, let alone the 14th, will have ranked highly in East Rome's geopolitical calculus. One might dilate further on Galich-Volyn's cultural-religious orientation and the interest taken by the papal curia in the mid-13th century in hopes of reorienting it with the help of a crown. But this is quite well documented. So too with an episode suggesting how susceptible individuals in the Lithuanian leadership could be to East Christian forms of devotion, after the Lithuanians took over the town of Novgorodok and other Rus strongholds south of the Nemanus River in the 1250s. At least one Lithuanian prince not merely took account of the cults and devotions, but, so to speak, took them to heart, attempting to visit Mount Athos. The episode remains murky, but in Vaishvilkas's story, we have a glimpse of the interplay between power newly acquired and religious devotion taken to ascetic heights among the new masters of the Rus lands, as also of the contrarian reactions this could trigger. Vaishvilkas's father, Mindaugas, along with most of Mindaugas's offspring, would remain robustly pagan for more than 100 years. So much for imperial statesmen's concern with the Galich-Volyn region before it came under Lithuanian dominion. I'll turn now to other long-term constants in East Roman diplomacy, starting with the emperor's unceasing quest for military manpower. Some years ago, I presented a fair amount of evidence for regarding this as a deliberate policy from the 6th century on, and I'll merely summarize here. The quest for manpower, along with alertness to fresh groupings with martial clout, was not motivated merely by functional considerations or the desire to flaunt exotica in palace ceremonies. The recruitment process showed worldwide authority in action, even if approaches to potentates in quest of warriors would usually involve the dispatch of gifts. This isn't to say that all gifts were for purposes of raising military manpower or inciting one barbarian grouping against another, but there was a connection, and the dispatch of authority symbols was commoner than is generally supposed. The latter statement might seem bold. Hardly anything describable as manifestly an authority symbol survives. Nonetheless, in recent years, enamel plaques, once adorning diadems or something like a crown, have come to light in Georgia, Bulgaria, Hungary, and even the land of Rus. And the art historian Paul Heverington estimates the extant plaques represent less than 3%, that's 3% less than, of the original output to barbarians. In other words, the imperial authorities were readier to bestow vestments and emblems of rulership on barbarians than you'd suppose from the ban declared by Constantine VII. The ban, he claims, is God's command brought to his namesake, Constantine the Great, by an angel, and now inscribed on the altar of St. Sophia. That a potentate might misuse the gift of a crown to turn it into a symbol of self-standing rulership was not of pressing concern to imperial circles, seeing that few, if any, of their own subjects would learn of it, any more than they did of the silk Michael VIII sent to Genoa, which we saw a moment ago. The recent finds of enamel plaques and such-like traces of symbolic headgear lend credibility to occasional references to the imperial bestowal of crowns in non-Byzantine sources. In light of these, there's no need to reject the statement in Thomas of Split's chronicle that Emperor John Zimisces sent royal insignia to the Croatian ruler in the 970s. I am not aware of any source explicitly linking the dispatch of crowns with recruitment. But one should note a couple of texts about Duke William of Normandy before and immediately after his victory over the English King Harold in 1066. He was already receiving requests for warriors before the Battle of Hastings, and a poem about the battle, written soon afterwards, breaks off while describing William's coronation at Westminster with a golden stemma made by a craftsman from Graecia, Greece. If vestments and perhaps some sort of circlet accompanied imperial requests for warriors, they could have prompted William to commission a full-blown stemma. One may infer that East Roman distributing of authority symbols could prompt more grandiose versions among ambitious recipients, as eventually happened with the royal crown of Hungary. From the 13th century on, imperial workshops were less capable of manufacturing diadems with enamel plaques, but the imperial ecclesiastical complex still sought to woo outsiders with deluxe goods and gifts. Indeed, we've already proposed the possibility of Prince Daniel's Greek silk being a diplomatic gift rather than inherited from his mother. And looking ahead, one should consider in the same vein the costume of Grand Duke Algirdas at his funeral in 1377. His vestment was, according to Jan Dlugosz, dyed in purple from shellfish, presumably murex, and interwoven with pearls and jewels, with gold brocade. To see in this fingerprints of imperial diplomacy may seem bold, and unfortunately we have no means of checking, since the pagan Algirdas was cremated along with his favourite horse. Nonetheless, there are other hints of East Roman interest in the Lithuanians' emergence as a superpower. I'll say something of this in a minute. First, though, it's worth considering two further constants in East Roman diplomacy. The emperor's presentation of himself as the mainstay of world order, well qualified to propose compromise formula in the name of church unity, such as occurred at several ecumenical councils. And secondly, the imperial ecclesiastical complex's stance of centre point, the curator of other people's pasts and keeper of relics and mementos of their pathway to faith. Emperor Manuel I Komnenos has helpfully left evidence of his interest in councils by way of reaching ecclesiastical agreements, while also banging the drum of Constantine the Great. He commissioned mosaics in the Nativity Church in Bethlehem, conveying the message that he was uniquely qualified to arbitrate between disputing Christian churches. Manuel's own portrait no longer survives, but one can see on extant fragments and 17th century drawings depictions of ecumenical councils. Manuel was then holding councils himself in hopes of reconciling Eastern churchmen with the papal position on the creed, while also seeking a concordat with the Armenian Miaphysite church. The Bethlehem mosaics were designed to show the emperor in the words of Lucy Ann Hunt, the role of custodian, caretaking the rulings of a church council, as in the nave arcades, and presiding over contemporary debate in the 12th century, acting as custodian. This leads us to a second point of the constants of Eastern Roman diplomacy. And this is the imperial ecclesiastical complex's stance as centre point of worship, keeper of what might be regarded as foundation texts and mementos of a people's conversion to the faith. A striking example concerns the relics of St. Gregory the Illuminator, the saint whom the Armenians credited with their conversion. His tomb was discovered in a church in a palace in Constantinople. The text relating this was composed under the influence of, if not by the hand of, Patriarch Photius, who made various démarches towards Armenian princes and the Armenian Catholicos in hopes of a concordat. This was a kind of appropriation of the Armenians' sacred past. The fact that the Armenians didn't owe their conversion to Constantine the Great was offset by laying claim to the remains of the Armenians' own evangelist, Gregory. His tomb had worked a miracle. In effect, the imperial ecclesiastical complex was presiding over his cult. Almost as striking an example of deploying relics for a mixture of spiritual and earthlier purposes is the equipping of the brothers Cyril and Methodius with relics of St. Clement, one of the very first Roman popes, before their mission to the west. The brothers' donation of Clement's relics to Pope Hadrian II is far from being the only case of relics calibrated to the traditions of the recipient. But gifts of texts, too, could be chosen to match a recipient's predilections. I'll pick out the case of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite and the cult of Saint Denis, Dionysius of Saint Denis, as he has become identified as in French traditions. In the 820s, a copy of the works of Pseudo-Dionysius, Denis, arrived at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, the gift of Emperor Michael II to the Abbey's patron, Louis the Pious. This prompted the composition of a new Passio of the saint, which was then translated from Latin into Greek and sent back to Constantinople. Perhaps this helped keep green the memory of the Franks' regard for the cult. At any rate, when Louis VII, with his army, approached Constantinople in 1147, they were greeted on the feast day of Saint-Denis by clergymen performing his liturgy. And such was the beauty that even Odo of Doi, generally so scathing about the Greeks, expresses admiration in his account of the crusade. Finally, in 1408, another copy of the works of Pseudo-Dionysius reached Paris. Presumably, the purpose of the deluxe gift was to remind the French ruling elite of the much venerated saint and cult they had in common with the Easterners. Significantly, the bearer of the codex was Manuel Chrysalis, a scholar noted for expounding Greek language and in literature in Florence and Bologna. Chrysalis had a lot to do with Western churchmen, to the point of accepting their creed and papal overlordship. Chrysalis and his diplomatic gift exemplify not only the imperial ecclesiastical complex's alertness to distant powers, but also its quest, around the turn of the 14th and 15th century, for common cultural religious ground between East and West. East Roman diplomacy had a long memory as well as long reach. These constants of East Roman diplomacy bear on the lands to the empire's north as well as the west. The indebtedness of the Rus for their conversion was probably harped upon even more vigorously than the way in which all Christians' debt to Constantine the Great was presented to other societies. The evidence is sparse, yet suggestive. Outward and visible memories were on display in St. Sophia for northern pilgrims to marvel at. The silver bowl given to Princess Olga by Constantine VII at the time of her baptism in the mid-10th century was seen there in 1200 by the Novgorodian boyar Dobrynya. Dobrynya also saw in St. Sophia a, quote, large icon of the princely martyrs, Boris and Gleb. This suggests a certain readiness to accommodate, if not appropriate, cults that were of primary significance to the Rus. With the aid of the icon and the memento of Olga's baptism at the hands of the emperor in Constantinople, the imperial ecclesiastical complex was reminding the Rus of the central place in their sacred time, and constant reminders of the spiritual paternity arising from Olga's baptism and her grandson Vladimir's conversion were issued in written form, judging by the protocols for letters sent to the princes of Rus in the 14th century and probably in earlier centuries. They regularly address the princes as sons. We've looked at some long-term constants in the East Roman political and ecclesiastical elites' modus operandi towards outsiders in general, while pointing out its awareness of how masters of southwest Rus like Roman Mstislavich could serve its strategic interests. The aim has been a wide-ranging backdrop to the Byzantines' dealings with peoples and powers to the north of the Black Sea in the 14th century. Relations between them underwent twists and turns in this period, and I'll leave them for others to unravel. But perhaps some of the ambiguities and U-turns are more comprehensible in light of the patterns recurring in its better documented dealings with other peoples over la longue durée. Against this general backdrop, one may highlight a few topics and themes of the 14th and 15th centuries, starting with the familiar one of the emperor's quest for military manpower. The Lithuanians were beginning to make territorial gains at the expense of Rus princes, and they could fight very effectively on horseback, as the Gallic princes had done in their heyday. The Lithuanian leadership and their Lithuanian-speaking subjects were still largely pagan, but as I've tried to emphasize, the imperial establishment kept the memory of Constantine the Great green, never entirely letting go of aspirations to convert peoples in Constantine's spirit. We have hints of the hopes of winning over the Lithuanian leadership from a leading member of the imperial ecclesiastical complex, Nicephorus Gregoras. Writing his history in the 1350s mostly, he offers extensive coverage of the Lithuanians, whom he regards as one of the groupings of the Rus, and the only grouping still pagan. Professor Baronas has made a valuable assessment of Gregoras' disquisition on the Lithuanians. Gregorus, he notes, resorts to classicizing stereotypes to picture them as, in effect, noble savages, fire worshippers. They inhabit a vast area, outstandingly brave in warfare. In Gregorus' eyes, this ethnos is unbeatable, one indicator being that they don't have to pay tribute to the Tatars every year, in the way that other peoples living near the Golden Horde do. Even so, Gregoras is implicitly drawing a contrast between Algirdas, whose martial prowess he praises, and Prince Semen of Moscow, effectively the Horde's chief tribute collector for the northern Rus lands, besides housing the Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus at his seat in Moscow. Gregoras acknowledges the use to which Prince Semen puts some of his wealth, his dispatch of money to pay for repairs to St. Sophia. Nonetheless, as Baronas suggests, Gregoras may well be floating the idea that Algirdas could cope with even the most formidable foes, in a sense repeating the act of Roman Mstislavich, I'd suggest. And to the observations of Baronas, I'll add 3 further remarks. First, the opaqueness and broad-brush inaccuracy of Gregoras reflects on the circumstances in which he was writing, and indeed his own background. At odds with the ascetic rigorist movement personified by Gregory Palamas, he advocated a more measured approach to religious devotions, defending the conduct of statecraft in traditional ways, reaching back to antiquity, and allowing scope for raison d'etat. His history amounts to a polemic against such champions of Palamas as John Cantacuzenios, whose own historical memoirs are a counterblast to Gregoras. At the same time, Gregoras was open to charges from the supporters of Palamas of being himself a barbarian, barely capable of good Greek because of his rustic origins in Paphlagonia. And this seems to me likely to have coloured and convoluted his prose style in general, and it's exemplified in his presentation of the Lithuanians in very heavily classical and rhetorical coating, while deploring their barbarous ways. He's actually making a case, arguing a case for employing them, preferably as converts to Christianity, but with enormous military potential. In any case, the empire had, after all, long found salvation in barbarian military manpower, even when it was pagan. This prompts a couple more remarks. First, the quest for military manpower was keener than ever in the 14th century. Besides employing their own agents to gather information, imperial statesmen could tap into the network straddling the lands now under Lithuanian rule, those of churchmen, but also the commercial enterprises of Genoese, Armenians, and others, as I think we'll be hearing about later today. My other remark takes us back to the geopolitical constant mentioned earlier, the capacity of the Gallic-Volyn region to bring respite to the long-suffering Romans in the manner of Roman Mstislavich. As I've already suggested, Roman's son, Daniel, was probably viewed in the same light, and if his Greek silk attests a diplomatic gift, it could have been made in hopes of military aid. In light of Gregoras' praise of the Lithuanians' fighting skills, and Algirdas in particular, the same may go for the vestment worn by Algirdas on his funeral pyre. It was, you remember, dyed in purple and interwoven with pearls and jewels with gold brocade. This is only a suggestion, and to surmise that other authority symbols, even some sort of crown, reached Algirdas by way of an imperial embassy is bolder still. But, as I've already argued, authority symbols were dispatched to distant rulers more freely than the Roman classicizing historians let on. From what's already been said, one may suppose the real politique governing East Roman dealings with northern potentates to apply to ecclesiastical affairs too. After all, Michael VIII Palaeologus was swift to come to terms with the Golden Horde on an ecclesiastical plane, as well as making a treaty with the Khan. An episcopal see was established at the Horde's capital, Sarai, in 1262. Nicephorus Gregoras recounts sympathetically Algirdas's bid to have his protege Roman consecrated Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus at a time when Algirdas was still pagan. And one may view in the same light the appearance and disappearance of metropolitan sees in Galich and the Lithuanian homeland, areas of major strategic concern. If I understand correctly, and Professor Zuckerman will soon set us right, a Lithuanian metropolitanate was instituted between 1315 and 1317, 10 years or so after the Galich See received metropolitan status. Admittedly, by the early 14th century, the princes of Galich were no longer heavy hitters. I suspect that the promotion of Galich partly reflects the cultural stock of the city's monasteries and church, which the Byzantine-born mother of Daniel Romanovich had helped generate, and to which the Galich Volyn Chronicle, an offshoot of Daniel's compilation, is testimony. Galich is notable for the well-educated churchmen it was turning out by this time, and the imperial ecclesiastical complex may have seen in a metropolitan there a useful provider of pastoral care and mission work for the lands coming under Lithuanian rule nearby. As for the assignment of a metropolitan to the Lithuanian homeland itself, this was done at the Lithuanians' request. But as with Nikitas Koniates' explanation for Roman Mstislavich's campaign, a foreign-based metropolitan's willingness to urge his local ruler to assist Constantinople in time of need was a working assumption in imperial circles. If one ascribes the appearance of these metropolitanates to the geopolitical constant of Galich Volyn's strategic importance, one can treat their speedy disappearance as a matter of realpolitik too. After all, the decision by Peter, the Galich-trained churchman who became Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus, to make Moscow his residence could register the generally amicable relations between the Byzantine emperor and the rulers of the Golden Horde. Peter's move was, in effect, to a seat of the chief tribute collector of the Khan. I'll leave it to others to discuss the reasons why Metropolitan Fergnostos, Peter's successor, pinned his colours to Moscow, and I'll merely note the Lithuanians' understandable objections to the eventual appointment of a Muscovite boyar, Alexis, as his successor in 1354, and the reappearance, for a while, of a separate Lithuanian metropolitanate. What's at first sight more surprising in terms of realpolitik is the declaration by Patriarch Antony in 1389, quote, "The facts themselves," meaning protracted disputes over metropolitanates, "the facts themselves have convinced us how great an evil is separation and division of that Church of Rus in many parts, and how great an advantage there is in having one metropolitan to govern that land of Rus." This would seem to fly in the face of the realpolitik of recognizing and honoring major new powers such as the Lithuanians. Setting aside for a moment the issue of continuing hopes on the Byzantines' part for some sort of concordat between their church and the West, one may recall earlier themes: the emperor's stance as custodian of Christian world order and dispenser of authority symbols. By the late 14th century, this could almost be called the emperor's raison d'être, reinforced by a patriarchal chancery functioning to quite a high degree of efficiency, as I think we'll be hearing from Dr. Mitsu, at least I hope we will. In a sense, therefore, the rhetoric was the realpolitik, for the centre point to behave like a weather vane, ever responding to shifts in power balances, chopping and changing distant ecclesiastical units, was demeaning and would ultimately detract from the authority of the imperial ecclesiastical complex. It therefore made more political sense to do everything possible to keep up appearances of continuity, antiquity, and unity, key foundation stones of authority, by maintaining the existing church order intact. And this weighed against humouring the Lithuanians, whose leadership was anyway, by 1389, looking to the Western Church for faith and authority symbols. For this reason, the imperial ecclesiastical complex resorted to other means of maintaining moral, even spiritual, ascendancy over the Lithuanians. Their rulers' Western religious orientation was, after all, no bar to the provision of military aid. In 1397, Patriarch Antony wrote to Algirdas' son, Jogaila, now the Catholic king of Poland, urging him to join the king of Hungary and, quote, even yourself on behalf of the Christians with your army and your resources to scatter the ungodly, quote unquote, referring to the Turks. The Patriarch could as well have written to Jogaila's cousin, Vytautas, Grand Duke of the Lithuanians. Such was Vytautas' command of manpower capable of steppe warfare that, with papal blessing, he dared take on the Tatars on what was effectively their home ground. Unfortunately, his crusade came to grief on the Vorskla in 1399. But the episode suggests why Vytautas, like his uncle Algirdas, was most likely a figure of interest to statesmen on the Bosporus. But how to make up for the fact that instituting a Lithuanian metropolitanate of Eastern Rite was no longer a serious option? It's here that the imperial ecclesiastical complex's use of relics comes to the fore, along with its insistence on the materiality of its role as centre point of world order and its place in the sacred time of other peoples. There was nothing particularly new about this. We've already noted Princess Olga's silver chalice on display in St. Sophia, and the physicality of the connection between Constantine the Great, St. Sophia, and heaven is palpable from Constantine VII's tale of the ban on giving diadems and vestments to foreigners. You remember that there was a ban, he said, on the altar, written on the altar of St. Sophia, orders given by God through an angel. And likewise, there's nothing really new with the idea of the great palace being replete with relics. What's more arresting is the fact that the imperial ecclesiastical complex was on the lookout for the launching of new saints' cults, along with the relics needed to fuel the new cult. And Byzantium scanners reached as far north as the Nemanus River, and goings-on in the town in which we are sitting now, or you are sitting now, Vilnius. Time's lacking to follow through the story of the men put to death on the orders of Algirdas around 1347, the martyrs of Vilnius. Suffice it to say that there's no compelling reason to reject the indication in their passio that at least two were high-ranking members of the entourage of Algirdas. Antony and John seem to have been converted in an urban context where foreign Christians were not uncommon. What rendered them objectionable was their appearance, their long hair and beards, marking them out from their fellows who were clean-shaven with short hair. And after they persisted in defying him by refusing to eat meat on fast days, Algirdas ordered them to be hanged. These and other details, showing incidentally topographical knowledge of Vilnius, are worth spelling out because they were almost certainly originally written in Greek. The passio was composed not long after the events of around 1347, and the drivers of the cult hailed from the Byzantine world. In fact, all our earliest evidence for the steps taken to have the free Christians venerated as martyrs comes from there. No less strikingly, the ecclesiastical authorities moved fast. In 1374, less than 30 years after their deaths, the patriarchal envoy Cyprian assigned to mediate between Algirdas and the Prince of Moscow, took the opportunity to collect the martyrs' remains and take them back to Constantinople. The ecclesiastical authorities, under Patriarch Philophilus Kokinus, sprang into action, formally recognizing them as martyrs, getting liturgical texts composed, icons painted, and the relics installed in the church of St. Sophia. It seems likely that the Patriarchate was already intending to activate the cult, becoming dispenser of its relics. Within 3 years of their arrival in Constantinople, fragments of the relics were being sent north, together with more traditional items like the True Cross and the 40 Martyrs. We know of the immediate purpose of the assortment sent to Sergej of Radonej, the influential abbot of a Trinity monastery north of Moscow, to induce him to throw his weight behind Cyprian, who'd brought the relics to Constantinople and had now been appointed metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus. But a much broader purpose emerges from a Slavic inscription on the cross containing the assortment, which numbers the new Lithuanian martyrs among its contents. Through gifts, such as this one, the Patriarchate was broadcasting to the Slavic-speaking world its ownership of a new cult of martyrs. And it was doing so while the ruler responsible, Algirdas, was very much alive. This was less a case of Moscow's side against a pagan persecutor than of the empire as umpire, noting those who bear witness to the faith and entering them into the record of sacred time. Indeed, Slavic readers in Rus, including the lands now under Lithuanian rule, might well know of the 2 Varangian martyrs slain for defying the Rus prince who was ordering human sacrifices. This prince later became Christian and saw to his people's conversion, Prince Vladimir. So one might still, in the later 1370s and 80s, reckon with the possibility that Algirdas too might see the light, accept baptism from Eastern priests, and become a new Vladimir. These initiatives show the vigor of the imperial ecclesiastical complex, championing Christian commonality as against political or indeed sectarial divides. The theme of resuming the work of the apostles recurs in Greek texts composed sometime after Vytautas's successive baptisms in the Eastern and then the Western rites in the late 1380s. Michael Bolseman, a senior official, protonotarios of St. Sophia between around 1390 and around 1397, composed an encomium, presumably intended for recitation in St. Sophia. The implication is that the churchmen servicing it are ensuring due veneration for those who had suffered for Christ at the world's center point. Curatorship of cults and continuity from apostolic times made a rather surer foundation for authority than launching new metropolitanates or indeed trying to convene ecumenical councils. Emperor Manuel II Palaeologus preferred to lay emphasis on Christian and cultural commonality in the démarche he sponsored or led in person to North and West, ever seeking military manpower. We've already noted the presentation to the French court by his scholarly emissary Chrysolarus of a copy of Dionysius's works. Manuel himself handed over to the formidable Duke of Milan, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, a small icon of the Mother of God in prayer in 1400. The inscription, the hope of the hopeless, will have evoked Mary's role as the protector of a city. She had long watched over Constantinople, and now the presentation of the icon to Gian Galeazzo implies she would take care of another city, Milan. Is it entirely fanciful to see a similar blend of defensiveness and assertion of age-old worldwide leadership in another example of what Cecily Hillsdale has termed visual diplomacy? And that other example is this. The major sakos made for the metropolitan residing in Moscow, Photius, a vestment adorned with pearls and embroidered with silver and gold brocade, and a hint that recourse to relic diplomacy wasn't due solely to want of material resources. Indeed, the iconography of the panels at the bottom of the sakos, which we probably need to see in a little bit more detail, this is the bottom of the sakos, the iconography there of these panels implicitly draws connections between the God-given Emperor John Palaeologus and his Moscow-born wife, both of them haloed, and the connection is with the three figures at their feet, the Lithuanian martyrs. Scholars have long drawn attention to the absence of halos from the heads of the other couple, Grand Prince Vasily of Moscow and Sofia Vitovtovna. Perhaps this has led to a certain underplaying of the relics and the visual message the sakos conveys. The three martyrs are haloed just like the emperor and the empress. And while depicting emperors with halos was nothing new in artifacts for foreign consumption, the juxtaposition of these haloed figures, the emperors and the martyred saints, would surely have signified a close connection. Moreover, this connection had a material form, seeing that the martyrs' relics were being conserved in Sophia and venerated in St. Sophia with liturgical services. Curatorship of a new cult of martyrs brought materiality to the emperor's long-vaunted role of new Constantine, equal of the apostles, even though Antony and his fellows were stubborn Lithuanian nobles, not evangelizers. One could say more about the implications of the cults featuring on the sakos, and indeed the presence there of the Lithuanian-born Sofia Vitovtovna. But hopefully it will be clear from what's already been said that the sakos exemplifies the imperial ecclesiastical complex's long-standing tendency to write itself into other people's sacred time, and in this instance, a people with a leader not currently under its spiritual tutelage, the Lithuanians. The sakos, with its iconography, is unlikely to have come to Vytautas' attention, but Byzantine ownership of the cult will have been clear from the liturgical services whose texts were translated into Slavonic. Quite what Vytautas made of this particular exercise in soft power remains uncertain, but that he was on the receiving end of other approaches from the imperial ecclesiastical complex is most likely and will, perhaps, emerge from the proceedings over the next 2 days. Thank you very much.
I don't really have much to say except to thank Jonathan for this magnificent overview. I think you've drawn out some essential themes for us, in particular the long durée of the kinds of challenges Byzantium faced to its north, the constant parade of people, and the similar ways of dealing with them, so the similar aims of Byzantine diplomacy in terms of obtaining manpower, obtaining protection from other people, and then carried out by similar means, whether that was through trinkets or ideological and historical religious manipulation. And the persistence in the self-belief of Byzantium well into the 15th century, that phrase, keeping up appearances, I think, really could not be better applied than to the late Byzantine Empire. So I think we can all thank Jonathan again, and I look forward to a lot of working out of a lot of the broad brush strokes that he has given us food for thought. Thank you.